Hi there. In this video, I'll be showing you how to create this fancy slider in Bricks Builder. We'll be using nothing more than the nested slider element, which already comes with bricks, so no extra plugins are needed to achieve these results. This tutorial was inspired by a post from a user in the Bricks Builder Facebook group. I've tried to replicate the same effects as you see in the reference video. By the end of this video, we should have something like this. Among other things, you'll learn how to supercharge your slider using some advanced options that go way beyond what you would normally find in the Bricks slider settings. And I think that's where the genius behind Bricks as a software really shines through. I like how the software is designed to help you along for the basics, but also seamlessly step out of the way when you need to do more advanced work. So it doesn't feel like you are hacking the software to do something it wasn't designed for. And that's truly a work of art. Anyways, enough of me gushing over bricks. Let's get started. So first I'll add a section, and inside that section I'll add a block. I'm going to begin by designing our product card. So this block is going to be the product card. Here I'll add in another block which will contain the card contents, and then I'll add an image. Inside the content, I'll add a heading and a basic text element, which will be the product taxonomy. So I'll just name that tax for now. One more thing I'll do is to add a slider. Be mindful to use the nestable slider. Now the nestable slider in Bricks is actually based on the Splide slider engine, which is highly customizable and accessible. And so we'll keep that in mind as we continue to build. I'm going to take the slider outside, so we have this product block separate. Now I'll apply some classes to the contents of the product card. So I'm going to be using this BEM tool, which comes with automatic CSS. So it's just a quick way to name my classes using the BEM naming convention. So I'll call this product card. In your own case, if you don't have a CSS installed, you can always go ahead and name the elements individually. So I'll go into the product card. Inside the product card, I have my content. So I'll call this one content. And this will be the title, the category of the product, and the image. I'll also go into the slider and just reset everything. I don't want any extra styles or content going on. So I'll leave only one slide, which we'll use to populate the other slides, because I'll be using a query loop. Then I'll clear out the background image, and even the contents of the slide 1, I'll also get rid of that. So we have a clean slate to work with when it comes to the slider. Now I'll drag the product card inside slide 1. And then for slide 1, I'll turn on the query loop and set the post type to products. I'll also set the order to ascending, and that should be all for the query loop. It should begin to display the content, but for now we'll go on and insert the dynamic tags. So I'll select the title, and for the category, I'll set that to product type. Now this is all coming from the custom post type that I have installed using ACF in the backend. Our image will be the featured image. So I'll set the dynamic data here to featured image. And we are obviously getting somewhere. Now I'll begin styling the image, but first I'll select the product card, which is the wrapper, and ensure that the class is selected, and then we'll add some basic settings here. So for the position, I'll set that to relative, since I'm going to make the image absolute, and the isolation I'll set to isolate. I'll also set the overflow to hidden, and the border radius, I'll use an ECSS variable, but you can use any valid CSS value. And then for the image, make sure the class is also selected. And then I'll set the position into absolute, zero out the top and left positions, and set the width to 100%, height to 100%. So it attempts to take up all the space of its parent. At the moment, the card is only occupying the space of the content. So the image doesn't have any physical position on the page any longer because it's positioned absolute. Now I'll select the product card and force it to adopt the width and height of its parent, which will be the slide. That way we can control the behavior in terms of dimensions and size of the card from the slider settings. So I'll select the product card now and set the width also to 100%, height to 100%. But I don't want this image squished, so I'll select the image and set the object fit. I'll set the object fit to cover. Now, there's one more problem. We have our content hidden behind the image. So I'm also going to set that image, the Z index to -1. Now we can see our content. And then using the parent, I'll apply some flex positioning. We obviously also need to apply padding. So again, I'm using ACSS variables. So just use the frames card padding variable, and we have that it's all consistent and properly spaced. Finally, I'll set the color to white, just like in our reference video. I'm also going to apply the same color to the heading. And now we have our product card ready to go. Now we'll begin working on the slider. Now for the Slider Nestable, I'll also add some classes before we continue. So I'll add here product slider. And for the slide, I'll call that product. I'll also, while we're doing that, add some classes to the section and the container. So this time I think I'll use a BEM. So the BEM tool basically. So I'll come here and I'll call that product section and product section inner. For the rest, we can ignore them. Now that we have our classes in place, I can begin styling the slider. Although most of the options we are going to be playing with as far as the slider is concerned are not class-based, they are actual slider options. So I'll come into the options and set the type to slide, just as we have in the example. So it's not an endless loop. I'll also come down here and set the speed to 800 and items to show, I'll set that to 2. Everything else can be left as it is. One more thing I'll do is add the arrows. So I'll turn that on. And we have a basic slider. I'll save this and we'll see what it looks like on the front end. So we'll have here a basic slider. Never mind that we don't have spacing between the slides. We won't need that in this video. And you'll see why shortly. One thing I'd like to do is turn off this link. I just want the plain text there. So I'll come here and I'll modify the tag here and add plain. So that's just a feature that comes with bricks. Now we have everything displayed as plain text and it's a regular slider. But we'll take it one step further. You see, when the slider engine that's being used here by Bricks, which is a Splide, as I've said, has a lot of other options. Although Bricks offers you, as part of the interface, the basic options that users will generally use to help you create any basic slider. But there's so much more that you have access to. You can see all that in the Splide documentation guide. And we are going to take advantage of some of these advanced options. And thankfully, Bricks actually is built to step out of the way and let you use those advanced options when and if you need to. And the way to do that is to leverage the options type here. So at the moment it's set to default, but when I switch to custom, I have access to provide my own options in JSON format. Now, the real question becomes, how do I find the options? How do I place my options here? Well, we can actually replicate the very same options that we've already set up here in JSON format, and then we'll build from there. So I'll set that to custom. And then on the front end, you'll notice when I inspect this slider, you'll notice we have some settings here under the data Splide attribute. So I can copy these settings. Unfortunately, because I'm using the Chrome browser, the JSON content gets converted. It gets converted to the HTML code. I'm not sure what that's called now, but I'll just copy this here, and we have to rectify that because we can't just use the setting here directly. It comes out as a mess. So I'll come here to a text replacement tool online, which I'll also link in the description below, and I'll paste that. So what we want to do is replace this code here with regular double quotes, and then click that, and now we have a much cleaner output, which is what we want. But again, I'm not going to just paste that in bricks because I like to see it formatted. So we'll be using a JSON formatting tool online as well, which I'll also link. And when I paste this here, it formats it. So none of the content has been changed. The only thing that's been changed is the layout of the content. This way it's easier to understand and more readable for humans. So keep in mind that you can go ahead and just use the snippet as you see it here, but I prefer to use this. It's easier to manipulate when we need to add our own settings. So I'll go into bricks and paste this here. And you can see we have the exact same settings as what we have done. Maybe a few more that are being shown here that have been already set up by default. Speaking of settings that have been set by default, I would like to point out that the breakpoints option here should be deleted, especially if you are not immediately using it. And I think it's a bug with how Bricks manages the sliders. I'll probably report that in the community and see what they have to say about that. But I've had situations where I tried adding some extra settings to the slider and I couldn't see them. They just didn't reflect on the front end, but they reflected in smaller devices. So I think the problem is some of these settings got applied again on a breakpoint with this 12 to 79 breakpoint, which is supposed to be our largest breakpoint. And if this is our largest breakpoint, we really don't need a separate breakpoint for this size. We will only need breakpoints for smaller sizes. Therefore, all default settings should ideally exist here and cascade downwards. But in this case, we already have a breakpoint for 1279. And so if, for example, we have a setting that for whatever reason gets applied and doesn't apply here, the breakpoint settings will always override the regular settings we have up here. So I think that's an issue for another day. For now, since we have access to the advanced options, we can easily come in here and just delete the breakpoint for now. Another thing to keep in mind when working with this JSON content is that whenever you have the last option here listed, you want to get rid of the comma, otherwise your code will not work. So keep that in mind as well. It was one of the pitfalls I had to deal with while preparing for this video. So now our content is displayed just fine, and when I save this on the front end, you also have the exact same slider. You can also see all our settings reflected here as well. So whatever we do here gets reflected here and consequently on the slider. Now, one of the advanced settings we're going to take advantage of is the width of the slider. So you'll notice on the front end, you have the slider that stretches from end to end of the content container. And I'd like the slider to be a little less wide. So we're going to fix that by using the built-in slider width settings. Naturally, you could also come here and just select the inner container and adjust the width if you like. But in this case, I'd like to control the width from the slider options itself, since that's available on a much cleaner method. So one of these options is the width. So when I come in on this page, I can always search for width. And this option just takes a number, it's straight to the point and simple, and it takes any CSS format. So I'll do that here. You would not normally find this option in your Bricks interface. So it's one of the advantages of using this approach. So I'll come here and following the same format as we have above, I'll impute width and I'll set this to a CSS variable from automatic CSS. But again, you can also use something like ATVW and you'll have the same results. But this time I'm going to use a variable from a CSS, I think XL. Okay, so I have a comma here. You can see it's not working when I have that comma there. The next thing I'm going to do is center the slider. So I'll select the container and just use the flex center. Great, so we're good to go on the slider. Now we can begin styling the slides according to what we have in our example. When we inspect our slider on the front end, you'll notice a few things going on as we scroll through the slides. So select one of these here, and here we have one slide, we have another slide here and another slide behind. This here is our active slide, and so when I select that and inspect the list of classes, you'll notice here that we have a class that is being added from the Splide engine named isActive. This indicates this is how the slider knows what the active slider is. And then when I select this next one, you'll see you have that class named isNext. And then for the previous one, you also have a class named isPrevious. And then for other subsequent slides on the queue, none of those extra classes are included. You just have your regular slider, which here we have this product slider slide, which is our own custom class. So we're going to take advantage of these classes in Bricks to target the appearance of each slider, depending on whether it's currently the previous, the active, or the next slider, or if it's not even a part of those settings. So that's basically what we're going to be taking advantage of in this video. So first, we're going to begin styling the slides. One of the first things I noticed is that in the reference video, the upcoming slide is smaller, noticeably smaller and taller. So there's also a difference in width. Another thing I noticed is that the image, as it takes on the active role, gets darker while the content appears in the process. And so the image gets darker so that the content is more visible. And so we're going to replicate all of these effects in our slider. And that final thing I saw is when this slide goes out of view into the previous state, as it were, it simply it just changes position, it shifts away, it doesn't get smaller, and also doesn't it just disappears. So opacity definitely is something that we need to take into account there. And so it's a pretty simple principle once you understand how it works. But we're going to start dealing with these things. The first thing we'll need to do is to set the initial state, which will be that which will be the state where the slider is smaller, and then it takes on the active state where it takes up the full size. So to do that, we'll have to set the initial state of these slides. We're going to target the product card. So keep in mind here, the technique we're going to be using to style these slides is that we will target the content of the slides, not the slide itself. Because if you have to play with something like the width of the slide itself, it's really going to mess with the flow of your slide. And I've tried that, it didn't work. So you want to focus on the product card, not the slide. So first I'll set up the initial state of the product card, and we'll begin by adjusting the size. So I'll use some CSS rules here, transform. And to the transform property, I'll add perspective. Now, if you're thinking scale will not be the right property to use in this case. It ends up giving us some jittery results. What we are going to use is the perspective property. So use perspective, set that to 500 pixels, add a space, and I'll also add translate Z, and I'll set that to -100 pixels. Now, what this line of code is doing is, first we'll set the perspective. In general, what we are doing is we are adding a 3D space on the page. And then the translate Z allows us to push the particular content or element 100 pixels in the Z axis, which gives us that illusion that it's getting smaller. Just like in the real world, objects farther away look smaller. So this way we have something more realistic, and it feels like as the card flows into the active state, it zooms further closer to our view, giving that illusion of getting larger. So this is a more accurate way to represent that. Now we have the default state of the product card. We also now have to take advantage of the active state. So I'll come here into the slide parent here, and here's where I'll add the CSS class. Select the parent and add a dot is active. So when you have two class names, keep in mind though, if this is your first time using Bricks, the root here, what we have here is a placeholder representing this, the actual class name that has been assigned. And what that allows us to do is we can always in future change or update this class name, and it will not break our custom CSS. So when I say root.isActive, what I'm basically saying here is product slider slide is active, and the absence of the space here allows us to indicate or tell the browser whenever you have an element that has these two classes assigned. In this case, you have your regular slider and the class on the same element, so they're sharing the same element. Whenever you have them together, then you have a particular kind of selection. So I'm saying whenever this has the active state, select the product card. So come here again and say product card. Now, just to be sure that we have our selection right, I'm going to add outline red solid 2 pixels, and you see we have the selection, and this only applies to the active one because we have is active here. If I were to get rid of that particular selector, it affects everything else. So this way we know we are targeting the active slide. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is reverse the transform effect that we have going on here. So I'll come here and just copy that transform effect. And this time I'll set the translate Z to 0. And we've successfully reversed that. So this effect only comes into play when the slide becomes active, as you see here. And you can tell we're getting somewhere. Now, I don't really enjoy that jittery instant motion. So one thing we have to do is to add a transition. So I'll come again to the product card and I'll apply a transition property to the transform. Now you can see it doesn't just happen instantly. It actually flows through it. It transitions from the first state to the next state. But still, we have one problem again. It's still happening a little too late for my liking. I'd like this transformation to happen the moment I click on any of these navigation arrows, which is where our advanced options for the slider again comes in. You're not going to find this option in the regular Bricks slider options or slider settings. So here in the documentation, there is an option named updateOnMove. Now, what this option basically does is that it updates the isActive class status just before moving the carousel. That way, we have this illusion that the update happens the moment we click on the slider. So I'll come here into the options. Oops, not a semicolon, but a comma. And I'll set that to true. So I forgot to add the extra quotes here, so that's why it's messing around. So now this should work. Now, when I select this and move, you see how the transition happens smoothly just as we slide across the slider, and it's a smooth result. And that's an option you can only find with the advanced options, not in the bricks settings, because, well, a huge number of people are not going to use that. Now we can continue with our styling options. The next thing we'll do is work on the content. So I want to make sure that the content appears as the slide gets into focus. I'll also work on the image so it also gets brighter as it gets focused, as it gets into focus. So I think the first thing we'll do is focus on the image so that the darker image makes the text easier to read. So again, we have to set the initial state. Basically, all we are really doing here is we set the initial state and set the state when it gets into focus. That is when it inherits its active class. So I'll come here and we'll have to select the image since we're working on that first. And we'll set the initial state of that image, which is that here it is bright, it's full brightness, but we have to set an initial state so that the browser has something to animate from and then to. So I'll come into CSS and make sure the image is selected and you have your class selected. Select the image and add a filter for brightness, which I'll set to 1. Now, there's no change. We just have to make the statement so the browser has something to animate from. I'm also going to add a transition. So this process is going to keep repeating across this video as we make these changes. So transition filter 0.8s. I'm keeping this 0.8 seconds consistent. That's 800 milliseconds from what we have in our slider settings, where the transition is also 800 milliseconds. That way we can sell the illusion that everything translates or animates at the same time with the slider movement. So I'll save that. And then we'll come into the active state and reverse or modify this filter setting. So I'll come here, I'll go back to my slide and make a selection. This time we'll target the slider image. So I'll just copy this selector. And this time we'll use image. So product card image. This is one of the advantages of using the BEM naming convention. So it's easier to track and manipulate. Then I'll place the filter here and I'll make it 0.7. So it's darker and you can immediately see the difference. So as I slide across, that image animates. Now on the front end, you see how the image gets darker as it takes on the active state. The next thing we'll do now is to target the content and make that appear when it becomes active. So you can already see it's the same process. I'll select the content and this time I'll use the opacity property and set that to 0. So by default, it's hidden. I'll also set the transition. And we'll go back to our slide, copy this selector. Now, when we click the slide, you see the content simply appears when it becomes active and it all happens smoothly. It's all fluid and very pleasant to see. Another thing I noticed is that the image is initially taller, so it's not as wide as we see here. So we're also going to do that, and you guessed it, we'll be manipulating the width setting of the product card. So again, I'll come into the product card and set the initial width, which of course you can do here in the layout and just set a width, change that from 100% to something else. But I guess I'll just do something here instead. I'll add a width there. Maybe just drag it up here. And then I'll add to the transition options width and same 0.8s. You can also remove the ease. Since we're using ease is the default animation graph. So if you don't specify that, the browser automatically assumes ease. So we just have that there for brevity, and save that. Set our transition is already in place. So we'll go back to the active slide. Where's that? Remember, we are working on the product card. So that width, we can modify that here. So set the width to 100%. And you can already see that animation happen as we slide across. So the width changes and it happens smoothly. It's pleasant to watch. One more thing I noticed in the example is that these slides just flow into view. So you can see the extra slide out there as it flows into view from that end. And you can also see how this one disappears out of view. But in our case, we have this hard edge as we scroll across or scroll away. There's this hard edge which we need to take care of. So the first thing I have to do is remove that hard edge and ensure that everything else is visible for us to animate. So we'll have that whole smooth feeling, like the slider just occupies all that space. Now to do that, I'll have to inspect the slide and see where that hard edge is really coming from. In this case, the hard edge is coming from the Splide track. As you'll see here, we have an overflow property that is set to hidden. So if I should change this here just for experimental purposes to visible, you see that everything now becomes visible. That's one. And then secondly, we have an overflow, a horizontal overflow on our page, which is not something that we want to see. It's never a good experience. So we can always fix that by setting the section overflow to hidden instead. So I'll first have to come here to my slider, I think the Slider Nestable, and then target that Splide track. So I have to come here and just copy this. And save. Now we should have the exact same setting. You can also see it here. We also have that horizontal overflow, which is a consequence of the slide. But not to worry, I'll select the product section and set the overflow here to hidden. Now the horizontal overflow goes away and we're back in business. Now, in our example, you'll notice that these extra slides are actually invisible. So we have to work on the opacity of the extra slides. And that's pretty simple. We just have a default state for the other slides, which we can do here by selecting again the product card. I believe we can select either the product card or the slide in this case, because opacity doesn't affect the physical space of the content. It just makes it invisible. So we could do either the product card or the slide. In this case, I think I'll do that to the product card since we already have things going on here. And I'll set the opacity by default to 0. Now that should make everything disappear, but don't panic. We'll go back in here and turn it back on for the active and the next slides. For the active and the next slides. So how do we do that? We have root is active here. So I'll just come here and set the product card opacity to 1. So the active one is visible. We also want the next one to be visible. So I'm going to have to add a new selection here. And remember, we're going to be using the isNext class. And we'll do the same, add that opacity and make it 1. So everything else apart from the active or next class will be hidden. Now on the front end, we have this happening, which it's not pleasant because we don't have the transition taking place just yet. So I have to come back here again to the product card, and we'll add a transition for opacity. Again, just to arrange and clean up my code, I'll add the opacity here, then comma, opacity 0.8s. Now we should have a smoother behavior, which is really cool. One more thing I've observed, since we're trying to be faithful to what we are trying to design here, is that as the slide goes away or switches into previous status, it doesn't get smaller. It just disappears. As you see here, it just disappears. It doesn't get smaller. But in our case, as it flows away or flows out of view, it returns back to that state, that transform state that it had before, which is pleasant depending on how you look at it, especially if you have a center focus slider. You can have the slide in front and then it just slides backwards. I think I might keep it, but for the sake of showing you how this works, again, we'll stick with what we have in the video. So what I'll do here, just as we've already learned, is to select the previous state and adjust the position so it stays the way it was. So all we have to do now is select the slide, and I'll copy the same settings we have here for the product card, but this time we'll modify it to only affect its previous state. So change this to is prev. Now we've successfully turned off that perspective or transform effect. So as it goes, you notice it doesn't get smaller, it just shifts out of view. We also need to turn off the width. So again, I'll set the width here to 100%. And we have that exact same effect. So I think so far we have the makings of the perfect slider, if you will. I'm not going to go into the area of positioning the navigation arrows or whatnot. That can always be done however you want. All you need to do is select the arrows, the Splide arrows here, using the same selectors that we had, and then set that to absolute and then position it however you want on the within the context of the parent. But so far I think we have something going on. But then there is a problem. And I don't know if you've spotted that problem already by now, but as I scroll across, you'll see that this last slide doesn't get into focus. It stays that way. And if you have a number of products, you want each slide to have its time in the focus position. But for whatever reason, this last slide doesn't take up that position. And I have a few reasons why that might be. One reason here, which I think is the most obvious, is that in the slider options, we have the slider set to show 2 slides per page. Now, it doesn't matter whether that slide is active or not, which I think that's where there might be an issue or a bug from Splide slider. But when you have 2 slides per page, it doesn't indicate that there are 2 slides in focus. You always still have to have 1 slide in focus. But since we have 2 slides per page, when you have those 2 slides per page, the engine just concludes that you can already see all 2 of them. And so there's no need to scroll any further because you already have 2 slides per page. Now, there are 2 ways to rectify that. One way is to either set your slide type to loop. I think that should be able to fix it. So that way, there will always be an extra slide there for you to keep scrolling endlessly. So that's one way to fix or avoid that issue. But since we are trying to stay faithful to our example, which is a finite number of slides, we have to think of other ways to sort that out. So the way I've been able to find a solution was to go under per page, set that to 1. So that way we are back to default, but it also negates whatever options we have here for per page or per move. Once they are set to 1, you can go ahead and do other things with the width of the slide and it's not going to be affected. Here's what I mean. I can now come down here and add a new property. Now, among the properties here is the fixed slide width. or rather the fixed width in this case. So what it basically does is it will allow you to define a width for the slide, for each individual slide across the slider, and it will ignore the per page option. So we're going to do just that. I'm going to come here and I'll set that to say 60 rem, I think. Let's see what that does. Now, each slide actually has its time in focus, and that kind of solves our problem. But again, it breeds another problem, which is this space here that nobody really likes or understands. And that's where another another advanced option comes in. I'm starting to feel like the professor in Money Heist. So we'll take another advanced option here, and I'll call this padding. Now, padding basically does what it does. It's one of the options in the Splide documentation. So it does what it says. We can come here in padding and add a CSS value. This time I'm going to say, let's see 50% padding and see what that looks like. In this case, it's going to apply that padding to the center. Okay, maybe 50% is just too much. So let's make it 20% and see what that looks like. So it applies the padding to both sides, which naturally kind of messes with our spacing. But I think this is starting to become more accurate, and you can see that the slide actually takes the center stage in this case, which might be what we want and might really solve the problem. Now, I'm going to take this one step further, and we can say, how then do we, what if we want that padding to only exist on the right side and not the left? Well, we still have that option with the padding option. We can do that. So to do that, I'll come here and just get rid of that. Instead, I'll add a curly brace, so that creates its own context for options. Then just like we have above, I'll say left. Now there's no space on the left, but we have that padding going on the right. So we still have one slide being displayed, except that because of the padding, you can actually proceed to have see the second slide that is upcoming. And I think this solves the problem perfectly. As a bonus option, I'm going to show you how to make this slider responsive using the advanced option, just to cover the basis and make sure that you have that option available for you as well. So we're going to come here and we'll add a comma here, since padding is its own setting. Then I'll come down here and say breakpoints. Again, you can read up on all of these options in the slides documentation, which I'll also link down below. And for breakpoints, we'll create a new context, and then we'll specify a breakpoint. In this case, I want this responsiveness or this change to happen on the mobile size of 478. So I'll define 478. And then we can have our own options in this context. So we can actually reverse all of these. For example, on the mobile breakpoints, I'd like to remove the arrows. So I can just copy this setting here and set that to false. May not immediately be visible here, but on the mobile, when you switch to that, you notice the arrows are entirely gone. But for larger devices, you have those navigation arrows. So this way, users can actually scroll. I also quite like how this slide shows, a portion of this slide shows on the right, which indicates to the user that there's something extra you might want to see. So they are tempted to scroll, which is really nice design. But I feel like that card takes up too much space. So we can also take advantage of the breakpoint settings, and we'll add our own padding here. So copy that, add a comma here. Never forget to add the commas. And this time I'll set the right padding to 10% and save. You can also impute another value, maybe a rem value or a pixel value. But percentages are just fine. Now on the mobile devices, you can see part of that slide, that next slide shows, which is nice to have. It's always nice to have in this case and helps to boost the experience. So there you go. That's how you create this kind of slider in Bricks Builder. Now there are tons of other options that you can always take advantage of in the Splide documentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the comments and I'll do my possible best to respond as soon as possible. If you also have a better way to do these things or solve these problems, you can always easily suggest, and that's one way to help the community grow. I'll also remind you to subscribe, like this video and share it if you found this helpful. Save it for future use. And I'll see you in the next one. Stay nifty.